How crazy is that reading, right? Oh my word. See, this is why you need to read your Bible, because there's some really crazy, exciting, like bizarre things. And others of you are like, no, that's exactly why I don't read the Bible, because that's crazy, bizarre, and I don't understand it at all. So listen, we're going to try to unpack some of that today. And actually, we unpacked a lot of this reading last week. Now, last week, we talked about Jesus' so-called Olivet discourse. He's on the Mount of Olives with his disciples, and his disciples point at the temple and they say, "Whoa, Jesus, this temple is incredible. What's going to be the sign of the end of the age?" And the end of the age for them is the end of that sort of temple period, the end of the period of the covenant with God's people from Mount Sinai. Moses and the Pentateuch, the Ten Commandments, and worshiping God at a temple and offering animal sacrifices and all of the rest of that. They were looking for the Messiah to come and usher in kind of a new age, a new situation. And they're saying, what is the sign that you are the Messiah? You're here, and that this age has ended and the age of the Messiah has begun. And Jesus answers sort of enigmatically, right? But he says, actually, before this age ends, you guys are going to be arrested. It's going to be really bad. Some of you are going to be put to death. There's going to be great persecution. There's going to be the abomination that causes desolation, right? And that's this military surrounding of Jerusalem and the temple would be destroyed, right? And in AD 70, that took place. Under Emperor Vespasian, the Romans surrounded Jerusalem and leveled the second Jewish temple, and it has never been rebuilt since. The only thing left is the Western Wall. Sometimes we call it the Wailing Wall in Jerusalem, that's right up against, it's like a retaining wall that keeps the Temple Mount level so that structures can be built on top of it. At the moment is the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And so we talked about that a little bit last week rather. And this week, I want to talk a little bit more about these governments and these beasts and that sort of thing. So we're going to talk about Daniel chapter 7 for a little bit, and then we're going to jump to Revelation. Now, both Daniel chapter 7, actually a lot of the second half of Daniel, as well as the book of Revelation, is called apocalyptic literature. Apocalyptic literature. One of the things that is helpful to understand about the Bible is that it's not all the same sort of literature. For instance, we've got the book of Psalms, which is poetry. We've got the book of Proverbs or Ecclesiastes, Job, which is called wisdom literature. We've got prophetic books. We have historical books. And we shouldn't make the mistake of reading them all the same way. Just like if you read In Flanders Fields, which is a poem, and you read that as historical narrative, you might be a little bit mistaken about it. You might not understand exactly what's going on. You might not be able to get as much out of In Flanders Fields as you would if you recognized it was poetry. Now, just because it's poetry doesn't mean it's inaccurate about the situation of the two world wars or anything else like that. It just means that it should be read and understood a certain way. Apocalyptic literature is similar. In apocalyptic literature, somebody is typically having some kind of a vision of sorts. And in those visions, kind of grand cosmic things are taking place. Stars are falling and mountains are moving and beasts are coming. Angels are doing all kinds of things. And there's all kinds of these sort of what one might think of as mythical, magical sorts of creatures. And they're not so much mythical, magical creatures, so much as representations of very physical, material realities. Oftentimes, those material, physical realities are governments and nations. And that's what we see here in the book of Daniel. We touched on it last week. He sees this something like a lion and then something like a bear and something like a leopard that come up and they kind of move about and they have activity. And if we were to continue on in Daniel chapter 7 and then kind of carry on in Daniel chapter 8, we would see that these different beasts represent different empires. The lion with the wings of an eagle, and the wings are torn off, and then it stands up like a man, is the Babylonian Empire. And you could, well, not today because of lockdown, but you could go to the British Museum and you could go to the sort of Middle Eastern area and see Babylonian relics and how Babylon was frequently represented by itself as or with a lion. And then we see this bear, a second beast, with one of its sides sort of raised up, or one shoulder raised up, and this is representative of the Medo-Persian Empire, the Persians being the more dominant of the two partners, sort of bigger than the other. And then we see this leopard with 4 wings and with 4 heads, and that's the Greco-Macedonian Empire under Alexander the Great, so swiftly, like a leopard, on wings, taking over the sort of known world at the time. And then this other beast with large iron teeth, and it devours its victims. It has these 10 horns, and we understand that now as being the Roman Empire. Its large iron teeth, sort of representative of their iron shields and their iron armor and their iron weaponry, and the way they militaristically took over so much of the known world, and rather mercilessly with these 10 horns. And these 10 horns are sort of difficult because what does that mean? And usually horns have something to do with power, or they have something to do with leadership. The number 10 sometimes means literally like more than 9 and less than 11, like a literal number 10. And sometimes 10 is sort of figurative. It's a way of representing sort of completion or sort of roundness. And for the Roman Empire, or the Roman nation, we can look at 10 sort of in a number of different ways, because we see that, like, remember, 3 little ones break off and 1 is in its place. And we kind of go, what is that? There's a number of ways of looking at the leadership of what would become the Roman Empire. There's basically sort of 3 big phases of Rome. There's the Roman kingdom, when Romulus and Remus, right? These are the 2 sort of mythological characters who founded Rome. Romulus, from whom we get the city's name, Rome, who is a son of Mars, the Roman god. He and Remus are twins, and they are abandoned, and they go down the Tiber River, and they are suckled by the she-wolf, right? And then Romulus founds Rome. He's the first king of Rome, and 6 other kings come after him. 3 of them pretty good, 3 of them pretty bad. After which, Rome becomes a republic. And when Rome becomes a republic, it's led by the Senate, and there might be as many as 7 different ways of looking at how they structured leadership, 7 different sort of groups of people who had sort of leadership stock in Rome. And that republic concludes with Julius Caesar, who becomes the dictator and eventually ushers in the Roman Empire under Caesar Augustus, his adopted son, Julius Caesar's adopted son. And Caesar Augustus starts the Julio-Claudian dynasty. And there's about, if I remember correctly, 5 or 6 emperors of the Julio-Claudian dynasty that completes with Emperor Nero. And after Nero dies, there's a year in 68 to 69 AD where 3 different people are emperor, are Caesar, for a very brief period of time. After which, a guy called Vespasian becomes emperor and inaugurates the Flavian dynasty. And he, in AD 70, destroys the temple in Jerusalem and puts an end to the covenant worship of God in the temple until today. Still, we're living in the consequence of Vespasian's actions. And when we take that thought And we see these three little horns that get displaced by another horn who wages war against God's people and speaks arrogantly against the Most High, destroys his temple. We go, oh, okay, here's the Roman Empire. And during that time, there's this big thing that happens. There's this vision in heaven, and God is on his throne, the Ancient of Days. And no matter what's happening, no matter what about Babylon or Medo-Persia or the Greek Empire or the Roman Empire or Julius Caesar or Caesar Augustus or Nero or Vespasian or anybody, no matter any of that stuff, God is on his throne. And there's this throng around him. Thousands upon thousands attended him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court was seated. God is sovereign. And in that seating on his throne, someone like a son of man approaches him. Right? And he was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All nations and peoples of every language worshiped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion. And that is Jesus of Nazareth. Born of the Virgin, suffered under Pontius Pilate, crucified, died, buried, risen again, and ascended to heaven to approach the Ancient of Days. That is what's happening today. Now, with that in mind, you're like, isn't that enough, Peter? Sweet Moses. I just need to sit on that for just a second. Woo! Okay? All right, that's fine. But with that in mind, I want to turn now to Revelation, which is apocalyptic literature, chapter 13. And in chapter 13 of Revelation, we see these two beasts, the beast out of the sea and the beast out of the earth. And have you ever heard about this, like the mark of the beast? Dun, 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 right? It's a big deal. Please don't misunderstand. I'm not making light of that. We're going to talk about that a little bit next week. Okay? But this week, I want us to talk about this beast out of the sea and the beast out of the earth, because we need to understand that before we can talk about the mark of the beast, which I think there's a good number of people are concerned is present or coming, whether that be in the form of a vaccine, or whether that be in the form of a one world government, or whether that be in the form of legislation or whatever else. I think there are people who are concerned that that is on the cusp for us. But before we talk about the mark of the beast, what are these beasts? Chapter 13 of Revelation, verse 1, starts off with saying this dragon stood on the shore of the sea. Now the dragon is, again, this is apocalyptic literature, and the dragon in this vision that John is having, right, is Satan, right? And actually in chapter 12, well, we won't get there. That's a distraction. Let's stay focused. All right. So this dragon stands on the shore of the sea, and I saw a beast coming out of the sea. It had 10 horns. Interesting, okay? And 7 heads with 10 crowns on its horns, and on each head a blasphemous name. The beast I saw resembled a leopard, but had feet like those of a bear and a mouth like that of a lion. Oh, didn't we just read about something like that in Daniel? See, this is why reading your Bible is so important, because it references itself. And you might not understand everything you're reading. That's okay. You're never going to come to understand if you never interact with it. Right? And one of my jobs is to help guide you through that interaction and to teach and instruct from this book so that you can become more well acquainted with it. And I know that sometimes that's dry and that's boring and it's confusing, but if you bear with it, it all kind of comes together in Christ. So anyway, he sees this beast come up out of the sea, and there's something about it that resembles Babylon and Persia and Greece. Right? And one of the heads of the beast seemed to have a fatal wound, but the fatal wound had been healed. The whole world was filled with wonder and followed the beast. There's some discussion that fatal wound, that head, the 7 heads can, again, 7 can represent something of perfection or something of completion. Heads can represent sort of power or authority or that sort of thing. There's some discussion that perhaps that wound that had been healed was the sort of the emperorship, because Julius Caesar became the dictator and sort of inaugurated this idea of the emperor, and then there was the betrayal, and it looked like the republic was going to recover, but then Octavian Caesar, ended up being Caesar, and that idea of leadership, that sort of imperial leadership, sustained and carried on. Okay? Now the whole world was filled with wonder and followed the beast. People worshipped the dragon because he had given authority to the beast. And they also worshipped the beast and asked, "Who's like the beast? Who can wage war against it?" The beast was given a mouth to utter proud words and blasphemies and to exercise its authority for 42 months, or times, and half a time. It opened its mouth to blaspheme God and to slander his name and his dwelling place and those who live in heaven. It was given power to wage war against God's holy people and to conquer them. And it was given authority over every tribe, people, language, and nation. All inhabitants of the earth will worship the beast, all whose names have not been written in the Lamb's book of life. The Lamb who was slain from the creation of the world. Whoever has ears, let them hear. If anyone is to go into captivity they will go. If anyone is to be killed with the sword they will be killed. This calls for patient endurance and faithfulness on the part of God's people. We carry on. Then I saw a second beast coming out of the earth. It had 2 horns like a lamb, but it spoke like a dragon. It exercised all the authority of the first beast on its behalf, and made the earth and its inhabitants worship the first beast, whose fatal wound had been healed. And it performed great signs, even causing fire to come down from heaven and to the earth in full view of the people. Because of the signs it was given power to perform on behalf of the first beast, it deceived the inhabitants of the earth. It ordered them to set up an image in honor of the beast who was wounded by the sword and yet lived. The second beast was given power to give breath to the image of the first beast, so that the image could speak and cause all who refused to worship the image to be killed. It also forced all people, great and small, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on their right hands or on their foreheads, so that they could not buy or sell unless they had the mark, which is the name of the beast or the number of its name. This calls for wisdom. Let the person who has insight calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of man. That number is 666. Here's what I want us to grab for now. The beast out of the sea, I would like us to understand for the moment, is Rome. Revelation was written in the 1st century AD, and it had to make sense to its first readers at some level. Now, we can talk in a bit, and maybe next week or the week after, about what it would mean for us today. But for now, we need to understand that Revelation had to make sense to its first readers. And the beast out of the sea, its most immediate representation is of the Roman political government. And the beast out of the earth is the religious system that accompanied it. Remember, I said Romulus and Remus, these twins, and Romulus was the first king of Rome. And after Romulus, I wrote it down and I didn't bring my note. Oh, goodness. It's a guy, it doesn't matter his name. The second king of Rome was he was a Sabine. And Romulus worked with the Sabines to kind of confederate and work together to help establish the Roman kingdom. And that Sabine king established the religious and spiritual system of Rome. And any and every single civilization has both a political power structure and a spiritual system that supports it. That's a really, really, really important point that I want us to glean this morning. The United Kingdom of Great Britain is no different. Now, it may be that in the past, a sort of Judeo-Christian spiritual structure supported the political activities, the political endeavors of the United Kingdom. And we might think that in our enlightened state, we have shucked off all that superstitious nonsense and no longer have a spiritual structure that we have to adhere to that supports the political endeavors of our government. But I want to suggest to you strongly that that is not true. Just because somebody or a culture is atheistic or agnostic does not mean it's not spiritual. There is no spiritual neutral. There is no spiritual neutral. And we live in a situation where there's a particular spiritual attitude. And whatever your spirituality is, whether you're watching as a Christian, whether you're watching as a Muslim, whether you're watching as a Jewish person, if you're watching as a Sikh or a Hindu or a Buddhist, or you're watching as an agnostic or an atheist or a Jehovah's Witness or whatever else, whatever it is that you believe spiritually has to submit to an agnostic dominance. Because nothing you spiritually believe is allowed to compete with the authority of Her Majesty's government and parliament. Right, wrong, or indifferent? Observation, not an evaluation. And others of us watching will evaluate that differently. But the spiritual temperature in the United Kingdom of Great Britain is that whatever you believe religiously, fine, so long as it doesn't disrupt the sovereignty of Her Majesty's government and what we believe is right and wrong, kind of gleaning the best from what we can from all of these different faiths and rejecting what we think is the worst from all of these faiths. And so we can, just like our mobile phone, just like our cookie preferences, as a nation, we can pick and choose and select a bespoke sort of smorgasbord of values, beliefs, morals, and ethics that suit us today. And in 10 years' time, we might want to revisit the buffet and fill our tray with different things. It's like if I go to Toby Carvery when I could, and I might go through one thing. I go, man, I want some roast beef, and I want some of that mash, and I want some of that roast veg, and I want some of that gravy, and I'm going to have some of this, I'm going to have some salad. Nah. All right, and then I'm going to go, and I'm going to sit down, and I'm going to enjoy that. Woo! But actually, next time I'm at the Carvery, I'm like, actually, I want some of that gammon now. And actually, with that gammon, I want a little bit of this, and I want a little bit of that. And now it's time for a little bit of pudding. I'm going to sit, I'm going to eat that. Whew, I'm going to give myself a little bit of a break. Whew. Round 3, baby. And I'm going to come up, and I'm going to self-select. And for us, as a nation and as a culture, we do the exact same thing from the religions that are represented on our island and in our world. Because at the end of the day, we are sovereign. Her Majesty's government and parliament is only sovereign because we are sovereign. And the challenge for each and every one of us, whether we're in the end of days or not, whether or not the end of days is tomorrow or it's in another 1,000 years, who is sovereign? Who is seated on the throne? Who is receiving the praise and the worship and the adoration of the 1,000 upon 1,000 and 10,000 upon 10,000? And who is the one like a son of man? Who's the one like a human being who approaches the Ancient of Days and receives that sovereign honor, glory, power, and dominion? And my friends, that is Jesus of Nazareth. That's what we talked about last week. I don't get to make a bespoke portfolio of right and wrong for myself, just so long as it doesn't get in the way of my neighbor. I don't get to do that for a number of different reasons. Number one, I'm not God, and it'd be wicked scary if I was. Number two, I have not poured my life out for you. I have not suffered the shame and pain of something like crucifixion for you, let alone anybody else. I've not risen again from the dead, saying, suckers ain't got nothing on me, pal. I have not ascended on high, having done all of that, to receive from God all honor, glory, power, and dominion and sovereignty. I don't get to choose that for me or for you. The fundamental question for each and every one of us is Jesus our King? Do we recognize his sovereignty? And I'm going to close with this thought. I think that's really hard for us in our culture on this island, and anyone who descends from particularly sort of a British Anglo kind of cultural descent. Magna Carta is this foundational cultural idea that even the king is subject to the rule of law. That there's some sort of external code that the sovereign is accountable to. And that the sovereign and the people must negotiate together to agree upon, and then we believe in the rule of law, and even the king is subject to it. And so likewise, as we approach God, the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords, as we approach Jesus of Nazareth, we think we're approaching a negotiation. We think that when we approach him, we're going to sit down and say, here are the terms that you must live up to, Jesus. Here are our terms to accept your kingship. Let's discuss and agree somewhere in a field in Runnymede. And if you agree, we'll accept you as king and we won't revolt and dethrone you. That's what we intuitionally think. That's steeped in our DNA from 1,000 years. We need to humble ourselves and recognize Jesus isn't that king. we don't give him authority. We can recognize it or not. The Ancient of Days, God the Father has given him that authority, that power, that sovereignty. And whether we're in the end of days or not, it doesn't matter. What matters is, where are we in relationship to that? And as we head to communion, what we're doing is saying, Jesus, we accept your terms. We accept your kingship. A covenant is like a sacred promise. We accept your terms. It's through your death and your resurrection and our faith in that we receive your grace and your mercy and your forgiveness, that we become a part of your people. We enter into not only your kingdom, but your family. We aren't just subjects to the royal family. We belong to the royal family. We belong to the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. We belong to the sovereign God of all. And so whatever the country we live in, whatever the country we fear, whatever the nations are raging about, we stand firm and secure because we aren't just subjects of the King of Kings. We belong to the royal family of the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. And so we stand, end of days or not, securely and firmly in him and with him. And we need not fear. So as we take communion, I want to encourage you, if you never have, or if you have but you've drifted or forgotten, embrace Jesus' non-negotiable kingship, because it is good for you. It is love for you. It is grace for you. It is mercy for you. It is forgiveness for you. It is life for you.